We are totally out of control today on the innovation side. Red shirt, and we have the likes and dislikes that are back. So like this video. I thought that what episode do I feel most confident about this week? I thought it's the frame game report, which is not on Monday today, not on Monday this week. I mean, it is on Thursday because there were scheduling issues on Monday. But I'm so glad that we still have a frame games report. And my impression, frame games, is that you're bringing this to us as a kind of idea that you've been exploring for a while, and it just popped out in our last discussion, and we thought, oh, that would be a great episode.
Yes, that's right. This one is so big that it actually it blew. It's like it's ballooned. It's a Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and now it's like a Thursday sized episode. So it was just maturing until now.
Wonderful. So, what are we talking about here today? The diversity industry's role in the 2008 financial crisis. First, for those who don't remember, what happened? What do people refer to when they talk about this financial crisis? Hello? Oh no. Did we lose Frame Games again? Alright guys, it seems that Frame Games is having so that's why we actually started late today. But it seems that we keep losing Frame Games. And so maybe I can just dance with the chat. The colors of Quebec Libre should be plum and white. No, it should be blue and white. All this color, it will take time getting used to it. But get used to it. I'm red. I own the internet. What are you gonna do about it? Emily has some crazy milkers. I don't know. She doesn't show much of her milkers in modern times. Emily used to be much fatter, and so she has the typical upper body of a female who has lost some weight after time. So typically, when females lose weight, what I observe is that they keep big boobs. It's as if the boobs refuse to lose weight. Frame Games, are you back? No, Frame Games is not back yet. He's gonna try to solve his issues. JF has some crazy beliefs, but I don't think he's a commie. You got that right. I mean, I used to be almost a commie, but I wouldn't say like in a very sophisticated manner. I was just a leftist out of sort of indoctrination, out of the intellectuals that I've been reading. And so I was brought to leftism by the environment, if you will. I wouldn't say that my position was that well thought out, but I was for generosity, and I was like, I was seeing the world as a system where how can I improve the world? How can I improve the world for my people? And then I realized, no, this world is full of shit. There's gonna be people fighting for whatever improvement you create. And it's gonna lead to people just draining services from your society. And there I became a right winger when I understood that all systems of generosity are exploitable, and all state-based systems are driven toward corruption. Pen Oshi says, JF, are you wearing red for your Native American admixture? Absolutely. My red t-shirt today is in remembrance of whatever Native American admixture I have. I don't know how much it is. But sure, I'm totally for it. I respect the Native American traditional societies. Um, I think they lived in a great world. Frame Games, are you back? Oh, Frame Games is having issues. Let's see what if he messages me on Twitter. He frayed a cord. Alright, he will pop back. Alright, I will dance with the chat. Come back fast. I have only 30 minutes of dance in me. Intergalactic Lebensron, $5. Thank you so much. He says, is there any imperial, you write imperial, but it's empirical, data to determine which side of the political spectrum has a higher density of intelligent people? That's a very good question. I remember seeing that data, so it does exist. I actually remember... Hello, Frame Games, are you back?
Oh, okay. Yes. All right. I will not touch the cord again.
All right.
Sorry about that. We're back.
But just before you continue, I will finish answering the question of the super chat. So it was about right wing versus left wing IQ. I don't remember on which side it is. So they say here in the Daily Mail, right wingers are less intelligent than left wingers. But it is. I remember seeing that, and it's a very small. It's a very small effect, and I think there's something more complex to it. I think there's the fact that high IQ people in our society are drawn toward academia, and they are drawn to become leftist within academia because academia is state-based, and so it's a very complex relation. And the right-wingers, they might not score high on IQ, but they're good at surviving on a farm with a shotgun. So that's a form of intelligence too. So I've never been a big fan of IQ to start with. I think that there are many complex ways of living, and IQ does not capture it very well. However, that's how it is reported. Right-wingers are less intelligent than left-wingers, but that's a little bit. Hello, Frame Games. So you are back. We were discussing the diversity industry's role in the 2008 financial crisis. So what are we talking about when we talk about the financial crisis? What happened? How did people feel at that time? And what were the consequences for the everyday people?
We're talking about the most significant economic moment in American history since the Great Depression of the late 1920s and early 1930s. And it was an event that tested people's beliefs at an ideological level, and then at an economic level, it led to a whole slew of economic reforms, and really became a litmus test for what kind of economic policy America would adopt from here on out. As people are likely familiar, we've been living in an era of extremely low interest rates ever since the 2008 financial crisis, and at times they've approached 0%. There has been for people who are interested in the libertarian style of politics, the response to the 2008 financial crisis very much depends on what your autopsy is of how it happened. And since it is the sort of greatest economic series of crimes, perhaps in modern financial history, it is deserving of a full autopsy that was buried by mainstream media and mainstream academia because of the racial and ethnic diversity component to it, which is absolutely staggeringly enormous. So I actually can go through why I should care about this sequentially here. I prepared this presentation, and here in the primer tab on the left, I hope to educate everyone tonight about the financial industry, and more importantly, my general worldview about why you should care about identity politics. And it's because to operate in the modern business world, you have to understand the ever-growing snowball of the business of diversity, of the industry of diversity. And nowhere is it more prominently on display with all of its concomitant ramifications than in the boom and bust of the 2008 housing crash. So why should you care about this? First, it will help you understand the past, which is so that you can if nothing else, contextualize what you've heard about those nasty, evil, greedy capitalist bankers, of which there were many, but their motives will surprise you, and who got away with their crimes. And it will also help you. A lot of people might have heard the mainstream media telling of who was responsible for the crash of 2008. And the mainstream media narrative goes like this. There were a bunch of evil, nasty, big bankers and greedy, predatory real estate lenders who were making predatory loans to poor Hispanic and African American underqualified lenders. They got too greedy and they went after the money, and the good regulators tried to stop them. They did everything they could. Some of them got corrupted, sure, but really this is just a tale of stale, pale male capitalism. And the fact that an overwhelmingly disproportionate amount of defaults and subprime loans were done in the Hispanic and African American communities, well, that's just evidence of predatory lending, not of any kind of regulatory setup that had been brewing for the evolutionary chronology we'll go over here, as well as the business of diversity itself. And as you guys will see tonight, it is big business. So if you pop into the Start Here tab, I want to begin the presentation by putting things in perspective for those who aren't in finance. A lot of people, are maybe in like the manosphere or video game sort of realm, and my background in business law, put me sort of front and center in a lot of these types of transactions, and I just want to make sure people have the sense of perspective about the kinds of numbers we're talking about. So if you go to the Start Here, and then there's a link that I have there from the World Atlas that you can pull up if you want. And it's actually a nice way to situate people. It has a visualization of all of the money in the world. And it shows the amount of money held in cash, held in banking deposits, held in debt, and held in derivatives. And just so you guys know, real estate is the biggest industry of them all, followed by government and then by finance. And this is the story of the three biggest industries and how diversity and racial identity politics have completely warped them. So
we're in a classical case of a state, and the state intervenes but does it wrong, and the free market reacts in various skewed and very non-beneficial and destructive ways.
Well, I would say that I don't agree with the classic framing of that, because the regulators are in on it. Many of them are in on it, as we'll see. And there is a public-private coalition between officials who need fundraising money, between voters in big cities, and we'll see the role of the Housing and Urban Development, HUD, in all of this, and inner city politics. So they need votes, particularly from the racial majorities who constitute the voting majorities of big cities. And so they need the votes from the lower classes, and they need the money from the upper classes. And what you have is this kind of evolutionary hot potato that is totally unsustainable. And we'll meet the people who saw this coming very far in advance. It's a lot like what we talk about with the demographic trends, and it has parallels to the Starbucks story we covered and many others. It's like a slow motion car crash where the people who are trying to warn others about how badly this will end simply lack the institutional power or the media megaphone to actually steer the Titanic away from the iceberg, so to speak.
That's what I understood 3 years ago, Frame Game. I understood that the truth was not enough, that you needed the megaphone, and I started building this channel.
You and me both, man. All right, so So moving on, if you double click on the world's money, this is actually the money supply. The reason I'm starting with this is because the numbers involved in diversity payouts and how much went into racial identity politics is so staggering that it reminds me of that quote that like one death is a tragedy, a million deaths is a statistic. I don't want you guys, when you hear trillions of dollars, I don't want you guys to think, oh, trillions, everyone's got a trillion. So if you move on to the, just double click on that. So we're dealing with big numbers, so it's important to have a sense of perspective of the size of the dollars at stake here. So in this link, if you want to pull it up, JF, this is the cool one I was talking about. It's also just a fun one to show your friends. It's a neat parlor trick sort of link.
CRA commitments.
Keep this in perspective. Oh, sorry. Yep.
This one?
Yeah, that's
CRA commitments.
The money dot. No, that's a different one. This is the money, the visualization of all money.
Okay, this one. Yeah, because there was no visualization on the other link, so let's look at this visualization. Oh my god.
Yes. It's the money.visualcapitalist.com one.
Oh my god.
Oh no, that's no, I'm sorry. We're going to get to that one in a second. It's the one on the page that says all the money in the world, and it's I can send you in the lobby if that's easier. Hold on a sec.
Well, I'm on the page all of the money in the world, and I click on money, the visual capitalist. All right. Yeah.
Yep. So this is the one.
Oh
so this represents in blocks every industry, the amount of money, and you can see what we're talking about here, which is that there is only $1.5 trillion in physical money circulating in the entire U.S. and only $5 trillion in dollars equivalent worldwide. So there's only $5 trillion in like physical money worldwide. And there's only $80 trillion, including all physical money plus all bank account balances of every citizen. Okay, that is like, liquid net worth. Okay, so there's only $80 trillion in the world if you take out debt and derivatives. So, with that in mind, if you go to the next one here, this is the slide with the 4.5 trillion. But I'll just talk it through so that you can follow me here. So when I tell you that the diversity industry extracted $4.5 trillion from big banks in just one single part of this story, I want folks to understand that this is world moving wealth, right? That is like all of the cash in the entire world, like all of the hard cash in the entire world. And like, I don't know, a 16th of all like, liquid net worth of the entire world. That was extracted to the diversity industry from big banks. So if you click on that link, that'll take us through what I am going to show guys here. Although I have the highlighted portions on the next slide, if you'd prefer that way.
Yep, I prefer highlighted portions.
Okay, so on the next slide, we're going to start the story in the middle, and then we're going to rewind to the beginning, and then show you how it ends and what the future of all this is going to be. So, starting the story in the middle, this is in 2007, at the absolute height of the housing boom, an organization you've probably never heard of called the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, which is a absolute juggernaut, but is not known to laymen per se, they proudly published this report where they brag about the following findings, and I'll just read some of the highlighted things here. Okay, the Community Reinvestment Act, which we'll cover, has encouraged an extraordinary level of collaboration between community groups and banks across the country. One form of collaboration is known as a CRA agreement, a Community Reinvestment Act agreement. A CRA agreement is a pledge signed by a community organization and a bank outlining a multi-year program of lending, investments, and/or services. Since the passage of the CRA in 1977, again, this is the Community Reinvestment Act, CRA, Lenders and community organizations have signed over 446 CRA agreements, totaling more than $4.5 trillion in reinvestments flowing to minority and lower income neighborhoods. Lenders and community groups will often sign these agreements when a lender has submitted an application to merge with another institution or expand its services. Lenders must seek the approval of federal regulators for their plans to merge or change their services. There are 4 federal institution regulatory agencies. I'll cover them briefly later. And they record and assess the bank performance. All of this will make sense to you very shortly here. But what this is, if you remember, JF, in our Starbucks series, we covered the CDC, the Community Development Corporation. We covered the real estate reverends. We covered the groups like Power and like like the Pico Network and all these other Saul Alinsky style local community organizations that served the purpose of political advocacy and plaintiffs' lawsuits to shake down big businesses. Well, this is the story of their assault on big banks and how the big banks came to love them. So,
the CRA is the law, or is it a mode of cooperation?
Yes. Yes, we'll cover it in detail soon. But I want folks to get a sense of what's at stake first. The CRA was a law passed in 1977 that had no bark until 1995, when it grew fangs of enormous proportion and set in motion many of the events that we're going to see. But there's a lot of other stuff besides just the CRA that we're going to cover. This is just one piece of it, 4.5 trillion for this one piece alone. So on the next image here that I put in the slide deck, you'll note that even though on the first page they brag about its 4.5 trillion from 1977 to 2007, right before the bust, 4.5 trillion was committed from 1992 through 2007. So again, like you've got a $4.5 trillion pool, and all of it was invested. You had this law that was sitting dormant for 15 years, and then Clinton comes to office, and we'll show what he did there. And the Community Reinvestment Act is amended to get racial. And to grow enormous enforcement mechanisms that allow groups like Power, like Acorn, like Fight, like all the other ones that we've talked about and may talk about in the future to bring legal action. So here you can fast forward, if you 2 images there, and you can just see a graph of what the commitments are, if you're curious. And they note even in theirs that they're underestimating it. That last slide is showing that even here they only did a broad category search, and they left out the smaller, the universe of smaller commitments to minority organizations and minority loans that were done through the CRA.
So the CRA stuff, where is the money coming from? It's the law compelling banks to give that money or to invest that money in that mode?
Okay, maybe we'll start with maybe it's easier to actually just start with what all the laws are then. Because I understand, I mean, a lot of this is pretty technical stuff until the fireworks hit. So maybe it is worth explaining that. The CRA is a law that was passed in 1977 that had the intent of requiring banks to do outreach to neighborhoods that they were redlining. Redlining was the practice by banks to avoid making any loans to anybody in certain neighborhoods because the entire neighborhood was perceived to be a poor credit risk, or the properties were assessed to be not likely to grow in value, and so that would make the value of the mortgage less valuable. And in fact, maybe we can skip to the sort of to the laws. Maybe we'll start with that, and then I'll come back to to this section, because this section I wanted to go over. I wanted everyone to understand the universe of what banks have had to do. But which would you prefer, JF? Would you prefer we just kind of jump into what
continue on the line that you had thought about? I was just asking for clarifications because we're talking about amounts of money, and I wanted to know where they come from. However, this graph is quite telling. There's something happening between 1990 and 1997 that launches this mode of business, if we can call it a business. We'll need some details from you, but it really propels this, and you see that there's something that must have been done in the 90s.
Yes, that is
absolutely for a law that, as you mentioned, existed for 13 years before. For 15 years, the law had existed, the market hadn't exploded, and in the 90s something happens and it's all up.
Right. And just as a brief primer on it, in 1977 it was passed in order to get banks to consider loans and make a good faith effort to try to make profitable loans to communities they otherwise would have ruled out. That's what it was intended for in 1977. But what happened in 1995 is they were required to actually make the loans. And the racial component was added, and a number of related regulations set in that had disparate impact. If you remember that theory of legal liability, which is completely unconstitutional under a facial reading of the text of the Equal Protection Clause, but is basically surviving right now on sheer institutional power of left-wing justices. But that may change now with Kavanaugh. But we'll get to that in more depth. I want to give a 10,000-foot overview here in this first section.
Now, to be clear, what you seem to be saying is that essentially we have made a law that was outcome-based rather than principle-based, if you will. We made a law that forced banks to give service to people until they became equal. And the world is not equal. And so we've put the burden of equality on a private agent through law.
Well said.
All right.
Well said. So this report was published by the NCRC, and I'm sure very few who are involved in this space have heard of, but I want to give a quick sort of investigative look into their annual reports, which I poured over, just so that you guys see how the sausage is made with how groups like Power from the Starbucks series sue using things like the Community Reinvestment Act to make their billions. So you'll see here on the first slide, and I'll just read the relevant portions here. They sort of reveal in useful detail what they do and how. So the NCRC, again, that's the National Community Reinvestment Coalition. And if you remember the Starbucks series, that third episode, was to be named Community Investment Scams. This is all the same concept that Starbucks fell into with paying off the diversity industry. It's all couched as community investment. That's how they shovel in the racial identity politics and all the politician payoffs. But so the NCRC was founded in 1990 to advocate for fair access to capital, credit, and housing. Well, that sounds nice. The Community Reinvestment Act, that law we talked about, and the Fair Housing Act, one we'll talk about in the next section, and other fair lending laws set the stage for our work. Our members include community reinvestment organizations, community development corporations, like the ones we talked about in the Starbucks, faith-based organizations, if you remember the role of the churches, and minority and women-owned businesses, which we covered in pretty extensive detail. Now, that all sounds, warm and squishy. But dig a little bit deeper. So here is from their annual report on their membership and policy. And of course, because this is sort of a shareholder report to encourage more investment into them, they brag about what they've accomplished.
Every
So
time,
here
Fair
they
Game,
brag
you
ab-
go to these documents. Every time you go to these, and you catch them bragging about some stuff that's juicy.
Well, it's monologuing. Remember, with like for that from The Incredibles, like the villain always monologues. They're always monologuing somewhere because half the joy is in showing how big your dick is that you got away with it, and you know how you're so much smarter than everybody.
Absolutely.
I should say I have a weird theory on Jewish masculinity that I feel subject to, which is like we don't necessarily compete on the same wavelengths of like, you know, glory by physical combat or whatever, but like the tendency to monologue is extremely extremely. I hope let me know if I'm running into any like, hey, I mean, I'm saying this with love about my
Well, yeah.
people here.
So you are a
But
Jewish
you know,
person, and you are talking to us about what you perceive is an element of your culture.
yeah, so there's a communal almost you know, tell us how you did it. It's almost like the magic trick. Like how, you know, how did you do that? And there's always, you know, that cathartic moment of like validation, you know, explodes in that monologuing sequence where, you know, it's almost like that James Bond like villain who, you know, takes too long and should have finished the guy off, and instead publishes everything in their annual report. So here is their 2016 annual report, and I'm showing you the 2016 one because I want you to have an idea of what they were doing in the run up to the financial crisis. So in the annual report, they brag about securing $62 billion from big banks in community benefits agreements that they extracted by contesting the bank's acquisition and expansion plans and forcing them to negotiate. So here's a little taste of it. So they talk about with KeyBank their community benefits agreement, and I'll show you what the community benefits agreements look like. KeyBank was forced to fund $5 billion to low and moderate income LMI communities, 2.5 billion in small business lending, 8.8 billion in community development lending. Community development is usually where the ethnic aspect comes in because it's usually to the faith-based coalitions and sort of big city council NGO type groups. Establish $175 million in philanthropic commitments. Do you remember that we covered strategic corporate social responsibility, weaponized philanthropy? It's not really philanthropy when someone's holding a gun to your head. And halt the closure of branches and open new branches in locations that serve various constituent communities. So, all right, that sounds a little more, you know, closer to distasteful, but still nothing too crazy yet. So here is a press release relating to their signing of the agreement, and you guys are going to understand how the sausage is made with how these shakedowns works. Okay. So the NCRC and local community advocacy groups achieved a major community reinvestment victory in the first half of 2016. And here in the first half, they talk about the $32 billion from banks as part of separate proposed merger agreements. Both major regional banks announced billion-dollar community development plans that would provide major benefits to LMI communities. These plans came as a result of collaborative negotiations between the CEOs and upper management of the banks and the NCRC and its members. Again, the NCRC is the umbrella group that is based. They represent 600 of those faith-based type organizations that we've talked about in this series. Okay, so they are, you know, they're like the national network, you can think, in the housing industry. So KeyCorp's acquisition, the commitment that they made to pay this money into these community development scams, essentially is what they are, is an element of their acquisition and was arranged through negotiations between KeyCorp, basically their top brass, and the NCRC. And in order to ensure that the potential merger that they wanted to do to expand their business would include adequate public benefits for the communities in their extended footprint. And this is on the next page, by the way, and the next image. After a meeting at NCRC's headquarters to establish the groundwork for the agreement, KeyBank and community groups held regional meetings to further develop the plan. NCRC and its network strongly supported the interests of LMI communities throughout the negotiations, and after talking through many initial proposals over the course of several months, both sides reached an agreement ensuring generous public benefits. The final agreement includes mortgages, small business, and community development lending and philanthropy to be carried out over 5 years. Now, here's something that might slip through the undiscerning eye or the untrained eye. In July, the Federal Reserve Board gave its approval of the merger. The acquisition will be complete once approval is received from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency.
They actually call him the comptroller.
Yes,
that's
the
an
Office
actual
of
word.
the Comptroller of the currency. I wanted to save a discussion of that until after this next brief section, but I'll just tell you in brief. They run the banks. They are the oversight commission in charge of all national banks. They are Big Papa with respect to banking regulation. And the head of the OCC, the head of the comptroller's office, is the guy who has final say over whether or not your merger, your acquisition gets approved. We're going to get into the role of acquisitions and all this. But we're going to come back to something you saw in the Starbucks series.
Are there so many banks that there's always mergers? I wasn't aware that there's a business of merger. And are these small banks that actually spring from the communities and they join together?
JF, your questions
I'm so naive.
It's great. It's great because it's going to help me sort of structure this for streamlining it and things like that, and help make this more persuasive to normies worldwide. But you're always you're like 4 or 5 slides ahead of me every time. Okay. So if you go to slide 10 in this, I'll show you exactly the answers to your questions there. And if you remember, I tried to explain in a previous series about how in the 1980s, the phenomenon of the conglomerated merger became a corporate tactic that totally changed the nature of business, right? Because it divorced who owns the business from who cares about the business, right? That's where the vultures, that's where you had, Gordon Gekko from Wall Street and the whole private equity industry. We're going to get to all of that. If you want to satisfy the curiosity on this, we can skip to number 10. Or so tell me what you'd prefer. We can do that, or we can go.
All right, let's continue on your path that you chose. Let's cover all things that you listed before we get there.
All right. So a little bit of further background, just so you understand the racial aspect that wasn't totally clear from the first few pages of the annual report that normies might happen to read if they, or so they had certain plausible deniability about it. Here is the kind of explicitly racial agenda that the NCRC has. And, you may have had some giveaways by the fact that, they're all about having minority and women-owned businesses, and it's all about getting loans into majority minority tracts. So, you'll see here in their 2016 accomplishments forever, you'll see some really, some really weird things that seem kind of unrelated to the housing industry. So if you go to the second image, the first one seems plausible. It seems like a lot of money, $63 billion. But then they secured $40 million in contracts and procurements and financing for minority and women-owned businesses. Well, that's weird. I thought we were talking about housing, not federal subcontracting. Get used to that, by the way. And then in the next image, you'll see sort of the political wing of this, which includes them rallying dozens of members of Congress and U.S. senators and over 100 national and local organizations to basically lobby Congress and its various oversight committees. So, for example, Maxine Waters was like one of their keynote speakers last year. So, to give you some idea. You're familiar with Maxine Waters, and Maxine Waters is the African-American female senator who is very sort of high-ranking in the sort of like sort of Black Caucus, and is sort of the most street senator in the American Senate. She's the one who recently had that famous speech demanding that everyone harass Trump employees in grocery stores and in metro stops. And did you not see this viral clip? This was
I don't know her at all, but it seems that
Okay.
she's been condemning Trump, and she's saying that there might be armed protest against her.
Well, yeah, I mean, I'll send you a link to it because it's just, honestly, it's just great. It's just great friggin' this is like classic content of our struggle. Like when the Civil Rights Museum tells the story of how we won one day, clips like this will be in there. Here, I'll send it to you in the lobby. It's less than a minute in length, and it is pretty astounding here. So let's see, I'm going to the lobby, and okay, cool. I just sent you the link. It's 56 seconds.
Right?
If we can't protect the children, we can't protect anybody. If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a
Oh my God.
gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd. And you push back on them. And you tell them they're not welcome.
She's talking about the Trump administration. This was after Sarah Sanders got kicked out of that restaurant in Virginia, if you remember.
Yeah, so it was after.
Yes. So she's saying, no, that was the right thing to do. And in fact, all you guys, whenever you see anyone affiliated with Trump, remember her. This is the top ranking senator's direct instructions. Get out of your car, create a scene, and tell them they're not welcome in places of public accommodation.
Such bullying. I can't believe it.
Anyway, those are the folks who give keynotes at the NCRC. And there's a fun little reveal about who else does it at the end of this, which we'll get to in a sec. But let's move through now the next slide, because I want folks to understand the scope of what banks had to bend over backwards, and still do have to in a lesser scale, but we'll cover that. But with respect to these community these community benefits agreements that they have to negotiate with these shakedown groups. So each of these images, we can just go through them quickly. And this one, by the way, is their achievement awards. Their highest honor is something called the Color of Money, the NCRC. And the goal is basically to change the color of money so that it's in less white hands. And so they reward the most influential media leaders and political leaders who've done the best job at changing the color of money. I mean, it's explicitly racial, right? Like if you're Martin Luther King style, judged by content of character, not color of skin, this should be ridiculously offensive to you. But this is what they do. They are a racial advocate under pretext of affordable housing. So let's just pop through these quickly.
What is there to understand about this phrasing, non-profit and minority housing developers? So you can either be white and not making money, or black and making money if you can and want, but you cannot be white and making profit. Is that what is to be understood about this sentence?
Well, based on the based on how it's sort of phonetic similarity to how the other promotional materials in this space are marketed, I actually see it more as cover than like saying whites can't make profit necessarily. Like, it's a way of saying make sure the nonprofits that you provide to are in some way related to a minority interest. So for example, it could be to like the Kellogg Foundation or to like an Open Society Foundation type nonprofit. But basically someone who funds the diversity industry, if not to the diversity industry themselves.
Suppose
So
that a non-profit was racially based. Would that count as political activism, and would that disqualify them from 501c3 status? It might actually.
yes, well, it would for 501c3. 501c4 is murkier.
Okay.
And 501c4 is technically considered nonprofit, but it's structured a little bit different because the contributions aren't tax deductible.
Right.
But you still, it allows you to operate dark pools and all sorts of dirty money shit, which is the belly of the beast for a lot of this. But if
which
you just
is what a corporation is.
That's what a nonprofit corporation is, and nonprofits make more money than anyone. I mean, there's a saying that I heard years ago that has always stuck with me, and it said there's 4 levels to power. The lowest level is as an employee. The second level up from that is an employer. The third level is an owner, and the fourth level is a philanthropist.
But it's true. This phrasing, non-profit and profit organization, it needs to be completely reviewed, the law related to this, because non-profits and profit organizations, they're actually very similar. They work in the same way. They just parade in different ways. Non-profits can be family based. They can be paying their own people. It's we have to abolish this distinction between the non-profit as a special status and it is a form of public good. It is not. It's a bunch of people paying themselves salary.
Oh yeah, they're paying themselves salary, but then they're also usually getting government grants, or there's all sorts of side deals that don't show up in the cap structure or the org chart with all their different affiliate groups. I think nonprofits are so much more in totality. I mean, they're just so much dirtier than profits on so many levels. But that's sort of beyond the scope of this. I want to be able to run through all this stuff quickly so that everyone get a quick whiz bang on the universe we're talking about for this one section of big banking meets diversity alone. Okay, and you can just scroll to the left with a click and drag if you want to make it quicker. All right, so remember, these are what banks are required to do under various community benefits agreements that they have to negotiate in order to do business, in order to get their business approved by regulators. Okay, so the next one, waive or reduce costs. Closing costs are fees and expenses that a lender requires a borrower to pay in connection with closing a loan. They often include inspection and appraisal fees, title insurance expenses, attorney's fees, and other similar costs. So basically, if you want to get the regulator's approval, you're going to need the local community activist group. You're going to need to cut a deal where where the bank has to pay for the borrower's legal fees and appraisal fees and all the related ones. Okay, so keep scrolling here. Down payments and mortgage insurance. Typically, a lender will only provide a mortgage up to 80% of the property's value, requiring a borrower to pay the remaining 20% as down payment. But high down payments are often impediments to low-income borrowers. And so the CRA agreements include low down payments and waiving mortgage insurance requirements. That is the requirement that a borrower buy private insurance in case he defaults, to make mortgages more affordable to low income and minority individuals. And by the way, whenever you see the word low income here, you can probably read between the lines a little bit right now, but the mask drops big time, as we'll see. The organizations and the actors driving this and why they're doing it. So if you keep scrolling, distressed properties are properties that are under the threat of foreclosure due to missed loan payments. Some CRA agreements contain provisions committing the lender to exercise greater forbearance for distressed properties in low income and minority neighborhoods. So that is, if you're a minority and you miss your loan payment, you miss your mortgage payment, these CRA agreements require banks to give those groups longer to pay back their mortgage than white or Asian groups, or depending on how they're going to define the minority neighborhood. So Are you kind of starting to is a tingle starting to go up the spine a little bit with like, wait a second, there's a whole different economy that
Lowering the standards.
there's a totally different. Okay, underwriting system standards. Traditional underwriting standards used by lenders can unfairly exclude low income and minority applicants. So CRA agreements contain provisions committing lenders to be more flexible in their application of underwriting standards for these minority applicants. So for example, with respect to credit history, many minority applicants lack traditional credit histories or have a record of late payments that discourages lenders from approving a loan. So they go through some examples, including requirements for secondary and tertiary review of all applications from minority lenders, including trying to offer loans to applicants with marginal credit scores. And anyone who's denied gets referred to a home ownership counseling program. But I don't have a problem with the last part. But for those who were close to the story of the 2008 financial crisis, this last one should start getting the noggin jogging. Dropping the credit standards because minority applicants are not able to meet them, and trying to provide flexible lending arrangements that they are required by law under their community benefits agreement. All right. So in the next one, we're just going to go
What
through
does
these
that
quickly.
mean?
It's on. So what that means is, these collective, these community benefits agreements require banks to have a flexible lending standard for minorities, but not for white applicants, meaning lower credit scores, meaning basically bigger loan risks. Alfarius Omegan in the chat just says, sounds like a predatory loan. Yeah, but who's the predator here?
You're being forced to be a predator.
They're forced to do this.
Now,
okay.
What's in it? Because usually when you make a law like this, you compensate in some way. Is the law just saying you need to commit to these loans that you know won't be profitable? What's the law giving in exchange?
They hope that it's profitable. And actually, as we'll see in a few slides, often what gets negotiated is a requirement that banks keep branches open in minority neighborhoods, whether they are profitable or not. And it'll be structured so that after they have to keep it in 2 years, no matter what, if it's profitable or not. But 4 years, if it's profitable after 2 years, they have to keep it going for another 2 years.
Okay.
So profit is incidental here. There's an overarching policy goal, which is based on the sort of Hail Mary, equalitarian, philosophical hook that the only reason that there could be different rates of default between Black, Hispanic, white, and Asian groups is institutional racism, having nothing to do with actual real world dynamics. Not even, apart from biology. I mean, just simple, simple FICO scores and individual, choices and cultural dynamics. There's this idea that in theory it should all be totally equal in terms of default rates. So loans, there should be no disproportionate lending to one group versus another from banks. So here's what else the CRA required banks to do. On the next slide, and employment history. Most lenders require borrowers to have between 2 and 5 years at the same job to qualify for a loan. But these requirements often exclude minority applicants who change jobs frequently, but nevertheless maintain a steady source of income. CRA agreements include provisions to address this problem, such as waiving multi-year employment requirements. Income source. CRA agreements have included provisions to broaden the type of income a lender will consider in evaluating the creditworthiness of a minority applicant. And get this, man, I mean, this is so dirty, right? So what happened was they started counting their welfare income as job income. It used to be you needed a job or a reliable, traditional, stable source of income to qualify for a 30-fucking-year mortgage. But beginning with the CRA, now if you receive unemployment benefits, public assistance, welfare benefits, Social Security, that counts as your income that banks have to count as, for determining whether or not you meet the income standard.
Okay.
Okay. All right. So obligation ratios, which is basically just about how your expenses to the size of the mortgage, they were all they were all basically dropped to accommodate the fact that expenses tend to be minority, Hispanic and African American minority groups tend to have less relative disposable income. So that standard was dropped. Okay, on the next one, minority and women-owned businesses. These CRAs contain provisions to specifically target underserved sectors. So, for example, they cite one, that expands its business diversity lending program to increase its access to financing for businesses that are at least 51% women or minority-owned. On the next one, property appraisals, basically agreeing to. Because there's allegations of bias in how property is appraised, how it's valued at the market, banks requiring to hire Black-owned businesses to actually value property in the area. Because if a white appraiser valued the house, their racism might value it lower. I mean, this is explicitly racial stuff. It's but they're required by law to do it. Okay, so loan reviews, on the next page here, Bank of America, agreed in 1992 to institute a 3-tier review process before any loan application is denied from a minority applicant. So,
so you escalated.
Okay, put them in the triple review box to make sure that there's no way we can't get them in.
Oh God, that is funny. It's like the guy. I imagine the guy in the bank with a walkie-talkie. We're escalating. This guy is black. Okay, we got it. And then there's a whole team reviewing. Are we really sure we can't give a loan to this guy?
That is what happened. That's literally that's what Merrill did. That's what BOA did. It's what Wells Fargo did. Citi did that. I mean, I'll get into like the main folks here, but that is what they did. They reoriented the way they did business beginning in the 1990s. And when the 2000s hit and the kerosene, and then the match was lit on this kerosene, it went fucking wild. Okay, so on the next slide here, economic development plans. I think it's the third slide here. I'm just going to cut to some of the bigger ones. Lenders committing to loan funds to nonprofit economic developers. So here's one. I'm just on the third image right now. Merrill Lynch has established 3 depository institutions in recent years, promised the Greenlining Institute. Oh, what a nice name. That they're another one of these NCRC shakedown organizations. That it will make $159 million in loans and investments during a 3-year period to Asian, Latino, and African American communities in Southern California and San Fran. And will commit $16 million to recruit financial consultants to conduct outreach efforts in exclusively minority areas. Okay, on the next one, you'll see Citibank committed to a program where FICO scores, that is credit scores, your credit history, your history of paying back bills, which says how creditworthy you are. Thresholds are lowered for business loan applicants that specifically operate in low and moderate income areas. They dedicated $10 billion in loans and businesses in low income and minority census tracts. So they specifically lower their credit standards if you're doing business in a Black majority area, as determined by the latest census. There's something called the majority minority census tract. And so you can get an equivalent loan with a worse credit history just because you're Black.
This makes me think
Hispanic.
we could think if these systems are kept for a long time, they could actually induce population movements and even this phenomena that we didn't predict, like segregation or something.
Well, that's actually a funny twist, because that actually is literally what started happening in the Obama era, which is why cities are getting whiter.
Every time I try to guess the future, and Gabe says, no, that actually already happens. the final black pill.
Well, it's actually, there's actually a lot of white pilling aspects to it. And actually, I know this whole thing seems black pilling, but I put a cherry for everyone on the very last slide of the presentation. which is the God Emperor will actually save us, at least if his plan goes through. It's one of the reasons that everybody in the developer Democrat complex wants his head on a stick. It's because he's actually focused on repealing a lot of the CRA, which is absolutely amazing. I mean, remember, he's a real estate developer. He's big banks, big politics, big real estate. The dude knows the slush. He was trained in the swamp, and he knows what needs to be drained.
Nice.
And
we're talking about Donald
is,
Trump.
overdue.
For those who didn't understand your reference, we're talking Donald Trump, right?
Yes, Donald Trump has committed to abolish a lot of the nasty racial aspects of the CRA, and it is a hot fight right now that's going on. But that's sort of beyond the scope of where we are right now. I just want to hit everyone with the scope of it so that you understand there is no fucking aspect of being able to do business and operate as a lending institution or in the real estate market that is not colored by this two-tier system of one for minorities and one for, the ethnic majority.
Uh-huh.
And before you say this, and for those who tell you this is predatory lending, these are the black advocacy groups who put a gun to their head and said, you need to do this because we need the money. They asked for it. They demanded, not only did they demand it, they threatened billions of dollars in plaintiffs' bar class action lawsuits and disparate impact lawfare.
And they bragged about that. They bragged because they said in their report, they say, we use the law to convince them of what's this? It's extortion.
Exactly. Well, they bragged about it in 2007. And then what happened? 2008. So, all right, let's keep going here. Here's the minority. Unless you need to pause for super chats or you want to.
Yeah, we got a few super chats. It would be good to go through, and then we can move on to the next. Claudio Lara Juarez says, "JF, you said you bred Sickides and Betas as a child." Absolutely, I did, but I was not really a child. I think I was more of a teenager. I think I did between 14 and 16-year-old. I observed fish reproduction. You should do that if you have time. Alfonso Beltran, JF, if you can say frame game with a Nico, I will donate another $5 or $10 depending on how funny it is. Well, I don't have my Echo. I don't have my Echo effects, so I won't get that money today. Sorry, Alfonso. Josh Milo says, nice shirt. Love you, Jeff. Yeah, look at this shirt. All red. Halsey News Network gives $50. Thank you so much. He says shekels for red shirt nationalism, and he just gave another $50. And he says they also allowed illegals to take home loans without any real verification. Then they were hesitant to repossess for fear of not enough verifications procedures. That's very interesting, very worrying too. Snow Monkey Bear says, I cheered out loud seeing you in a new shirt, JF. Happy to see you have a change in wardrobe. Looking mighty casual. My white straight male husband says you need a suit jacket though. Love from BC. Well, I decided not to have a suit jacket today. I always have one, so why not relax today with Frame Game. Arjaz says, thanks for the great show. Producer Chris, $10. Thank you so much. He says, money is worthless compared to a rare based white Etruscan boar statue. I don't know what that is. Money's only redeeming quality is making style and wealth preferable to bloodshed, slavery, and dominance. Materialism is silly. That's a complex thought. I would have to think about it. Alfonso Beltran says, how do you know Frame Game or Alze are not controlled opposition, giving you bits and pieces of truth, but keeping you just one step behind? These attacks are hilarious because you have to have a content-based approach on YouTube. The question should not be, what is the intention of people? The question should be, is this content valuable? And you add your show toward the valuable content and you discard the non-valuable content. That's why I never make attributions of intent unless I want to frame an hypothesis about the world. I want to explain something better so that you guys understand. But I don't impute intentions to people because I care about the quality of their actions. I have an action-based morality, unlike most people on Earth who have, who I consider as a which I consider as a form of paranoia, to always be constructing the intent behind the actions. As far as I care, people should be punished and rewarded according to their output. Period. You are a black box, and the rest, your value in the world is your action. DP $20, thank you so much. He says you can't find journalism like this anywhere else. Fantastic work, gentlemen. Well, it is mostly work by Frame Games, I have to admit. I'm just trying to make the comment lighter and more directed to what a normie would want to know. Alfonso Beltran says, like Goldstein's book revealing only what you already knew or could have surmised yourself, revealing small treasure chest so you never find the mine in backyard. Alfonso, what's happening? Are you okay, oh no, he was referring to his previous chat. Yeah, so yeah, I gave my answer to you, Alfonso. Gentile McCockerson, $4.88. Look at me, I am the SJW now. Kai, $10 says, Jeff, concerning your earlier question, it was libertarians who scored highest on IQ due to them scoring the highest at systematizing and other factors which complement IQ. Well, yeah, for something like libertarians where there's a smaller number of them, I'm not surprised that it correlates with IQ because you tend to have only a fringe elite, and you need to have some sort of intellectual capacity to even care about libertarianism and its structure. Frederick White, $2, says the FHA is anti-Catholic, and so-called Justice Wire says, I see that you have a tan. Do you still identify as white? You guys should not be alarmed with my tan changing. It's not so much the tan, it's sometimes the camera settings and the lighting. All of this influences my tan a lot. I could look as white as I looked 8 months ago, but I just have this new camera. I have this lighting, and so it gives me a tan. And the way the camera is set, the brightness will highly influence these things. So don't trust what you see. It's all an illusion. Robert Paulson finally gives $1, $2, $3, $4, $12.34, and he says frame game contributions to the public space will be studied by future historians. That's a nice thought. What do you think? Do you think that we're spamming history so much that future historians will just not be able to handle the amount of content? And they won't be able to understand the world of today? Or do you think there will be specialists of the 2018 period?
Well, you know me, I'm a transhuman Afrofuturist. So, I think in the future, we're going to be able to process information at a lot faster speed, and it'll all be, information will be able to be processed and systematized very efficiently. So all this stuff will be pretty easy to download. But I mean, no, it's a very kind comment.
Can I make are you suggesting that there will be AI historians?
I'm suggesting that I don't think people will be able to compete as I think as the industry in genetics continues to mature. I think that people are going to look at the natural human condition the way people currently look at the Amish.
That's the subject of my book. I'm very alarmed by this.
It can go either way. Things aren't so great right now either. So,
oh God, a transhumanist.
Well,
I got infiltrated.
There you go. I'm actually controlled opposition by the. I'm actually a secret lobbyist for the genetic engineering lobby. That's what I'm here.
All right, what were you about to say? I think I've been cutting you since 3 minutes. What were you about to say?
I wanted to respond to Halsey's super chat here because I don't know whether intentionally or not, but he actually hit on a key reveal in the story that we're going to get to. He mentioned that illegal immigrants got home loans without any real verification. And one of the interesting histories of this story is that it's much more about the Hispanic community than it is about the African American community with respect to the identity politics drivers of it. And it is absolutely astounding, the sausage behind that. And I'm going to play you guys all direct source videos so that you can see with your own eyes exactly what Halsey's point about, gee, why the focus on illegal immigrants and why Hispanics necessarily if there's no history of redlining or there's no like legacy of slavery or systemic discrimination. If you remember, anti-Hispanic racism wasn't even a political issue until the 1980s. I mean, there weren't enough of them in the country, and they didn't have the political clout. They had nothing to do with the 1960s civil rights movement. There was a little bit of Cesar Chavez, stuff out in California, and La Raza and stuff like that. But they were relatively bit players until the gates swung open after 1965, and really sort of came to fruition in the 1980s and 90s. That we're going to come to that part of the story, but it's sort of prophetic, actually, what Halsey got to there. So,
all right,
I'm just going to run through the end of this section, if that's cool.
Yeah, let's go.
Okay, so we're still talking about what the diversity industries lobby is requiring banks to do in their business charters, basically. So the next one is minority vending. Many CRA agreements contain commitments by lenders to stimulate the minority business sector by using minority businesses for banking contracts. So, for example, Bank of the West set aside $250 million for minority vendor contracts. It's $250 million just to vendors, from the supplier diversity program that we covered with Starbucks, that they paid into, and some other examples, pledges to spend, $15 million with African-American vendors here and there, pledges to allocate 40% of its vendor contracts to women-owned, minority-owned, and disabled-owned business enterprises, but at least 75% of that 45% has to be by minority-owned or disabled-owned.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, these are literal racial set-asides. You can't get the contract unless, no contracts for white men, basically, if you want to think of it that way.
Yeah.
By the big banking sector. 25% of it contract set-asides in other cases. Consumer loans, $10 billion set-asides for consumer loans to minority applicants. Branch policies, pledges to, this is what we talked about, you're not allowed to shut down the bank in the area, even if there are riots, even if it's unprofitable. You need to keep it open, or else we're going to repeal your charter. All right, we're almost at the end of this, so thanks for sort of bearing with me on this section. I know it's maybe a lot of like black bills all at once, it looks like, but we're going to come to the other end of it.
Branch policies.
Yeah. So, all right. Yep. So the next one is requirements to open cities in these neighborhoods. Bank staff and structure, committing lenders to hire staff who are representative of the community, and educating the staff on the special credit needs of minority individuals and modify the structure of their bank to accordingly. Hiring policies that employees of the banks in minority neighborhoods have to have majority minority employees, as well as overhauling the executive compensation like Wachovia did, so that executive managed compensation packages are tied to how well they achieve their diversity goals. So this should all sound familiar from Starbucks, if you remember how they got a license to operate in Bed-Stuy and in South and these other like poor black neighborhoods, the 15 new stores they opened, but then they committed that they would use only minority vendors and minority employees. It's the license to do business. It's paying the regulators based on racial pay to play so that you have a license to operate as a basically white institution in a black neighborhood. All right. So I'll make this quick. Okay. Requirements to appoint minority members to your bank's board. requirements in advertising, committed minimal amounts to paying newspaper, radio, and TV ads targeted at minority audiences. Requirements that banks meet with the ministers of African American churches on a regular basis. Are you starting to get the picture of why Howard Schultz and Kevin Johnson, the founder and CEO of Starbucks, had to meet with the dinky ministers of a Philadelphia African American church? Like, is the picture starting to gel here?
If these guys came to my business and I'm sitting on my big boss chair and they're like, Jeff, we need you to do all this, I'm like, you get the fuck out right now. There's no way I want to do this.
Yeah, well, once you see the incentive structure and what leverage they have over you, they have both a carrot and a stick. Because if you don't do it, you're going to get totally fucking fucked in terms of 64 Act, 68 Act, 77 Act lawsuits, and you're not going to be able to do business. You're not going to be able to get a business charter. You're going to get destroyed. You're not going to be able to have a license to operate. And if you do it, then you have the ability to have a basically, relatively, cartel style protected business, because many banks can't afford to play ball. This is, remember how I said in the beginning, it's a story of how the diversity industry, extracted trillions from the big banks and how the big banks came to love them. Well, it's because this also plays into, there are a number of things in it for them. But let's start with Gordon Gekko and answering your earlier question, which is on the next slide. What's big bank mega mergers got to do with it? So if you click on the first image, I'm going to give you a little bit of background here. And I've taken pains to include every single reference in lower font at the bottom of every slide. In 1994, the Regal-Neal Interstate Banking and Branching Efficiency Act for the first time allowed banks to merge across state lines under federal law. That is, to allow big bank mega conglomerates that were never allowed before 1994. Under these circumstances, the enforcement provisions of the CRA, which required regulators to withhold approvals of applicants for banks that did not have a satisfactory, racial investment scorecard, became particularly relevant for large banks that applied to federal bank regulators for merger approvals. In a 2007 speech, again, 2007, right before the axe fell, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke stated that after the enactment of Regal-Neal, as public scrutiny of bank merger and acquisition activity escalated, advocacy groups like NCRC, like Power, like all the ones we've covered, increasingly used the public comment process to protest bank applications on CRA grounds. In instances of highly contested applications, the Federal Reserve Board and other agencies held public meetings to allow the public and the applicants to comment on the lending records of the banks, which were made public, in question. In response to these new pressures, banks began to devote more resources to their CRA programs. So again, that's like after 1994. Now, from that same 2007 NCRC report, check out the next image. A significant trend has been the increase. Now, remember, the writing in 2007, when skies are blue and things are, it's going to go up forever. A significant trend has been the increase of large voluntary pledges by banks starting in the late 1990s and continuing today. And what they mean is pledges of money to the diversity industry without us needing to shake them down first. Do you understand?
Yeah. It's a phenomenon in people being terrorized, really. It's the people are in a bank, they get robbed, and it's the one customer that goes to the robber and says, I want to help.
Yeah, well, they got in on it too, though. So just picking this back up, in the late 1980s and the first part of the 90s, banks and community groups often negotiated then signed CRA agreements. More recently, as banks became large national level lenders, they increasingly announced unilateral pledges, totally by themselves, in tens or hundreds of billions of dollars, unilaterally, philanthropically, deciding to give tens of billions of dollars that covered CRA-related lending and investing. Some of those unilateral pledges have detailed subtotals, including like the race of the communities served. Now check out the next highlighted section. For example, 1998 was a year of mega mergers that included Bank of America and Nations Bank merger, as well as Citigroup's acquisition of Travelers. CRA pledges totaled $812 billion as a result. That is, diversity industry pledges totaled $812 billion. Every time you see CRA, think diversity industry. The following year saw fewer mega mergers and considerably less reinvestment dollars, voluntary reinvestment dollars. CRA pledges shot up again in 2003, and particularly in 2004. The year 2004 was a year experiencing watershed mega mergers as Bank of America acquired Fleet, JP Morgan acquired Bank One, and Citizens acquired Charter One. And then pledges slowed significantly from 2005 to 2007 as with less merger activity. So when they know they need to get approved for a merger, they make voluntary contributions of tens or hundreds of billions of dollars to minority groups in order to buy off the comptroller's office to make sure they get approval, and the HUD and a couple of the regulators we'll talk about. And then the next image is just a compliance guide that's just kind of useful to reinforce that regulators, if you don't have at least a satisfactory rating, the regulators can bar you. But check out before I do the big reveal here, which I hope is shocking to you as it was to me when I first found it. I want to take a step back and ask you if any of this, JF, sounds familiar. You're kind of the straight guy in this particular drama right now.
Yeah.
And does it? Let me give you a fact pattern. Let me ask you if it sounds familiar. Racial lawsuits to block corporate mega mergers, then collecting billions of dollars as a payoff in connection with regulatory approval. Does that sound like anything we talked about? If you go to the next slide, it should start to ring a bell.
We are keeping a company from doing what it wants to do and what is in its interest to do. And we are then using the racial card to lever up our community and say, we're going to let you do that if you give us money. So that's the Starbucks story. That's what Starbucks did with the city councils.
That's what Starbucks did with the city councils. But do you remember something else we talked about? It's if you go to the next slide, I have all the images there for folks to see. I think we covered this in part 2 of the Starbucks series.
Files 10 billion lawsuit. So that is the FCC regulation of media.
Now, do you remember exactly what happened there? Remember, Comcast was trying to do its biggest merger ever, and Byron, and so was AT&T. And so what does Byron Allen do? Is he sues each of them for respectively $10 billion and $20 billion during the review period for their for regulatory approval by the FCC. And if you remember, that was the amazing case, because of how instructive it is, where he also sued not just the sort of big white and Jewish businesses like AT&T and Time Warner and whatnot, but he also sued the black advocacy groups like Al Sharpton and the National Action Network, because he said that they were getting kickbacks to basically lean on the federal regulators to approve it because of their signed memorandum of understanding backing the merger. And then he documented that with basically millions of dollars in back channel payments to these black advocacy groups.
Absolutely,
so
I remember. He out-blacked Al Sharpton.
Yeah, so on the next slide, if you remember, Byron Allen in that case, it seemed ridiculous, right? You're going to sue him for $10 billion because they don't have enough 100% black-owned businesses. You remember, they weren't saying you don't have enough minority-owned businesses. They need to be 100% black-owned. Mm-hmm. And they won. They got a judgment that got them millions of new sort of subscriber reaches, seven new channels. This whole program for racial affirmative action that was required by the federal regulators as part of an 8-year program, that the merger was approved conditional on AT&T, on Comcast, launching these African American channels within certain time thresholds of the merger. So if you go on the next slide, I can show you all the citations for that.
Byron Allen scores a win in AT&T discrimination suit.
Yeah, and so a postscript to what we actually talked about is that after the merger, Byron Allen then went after Comcast again, saying that they weren't implementing the new channels for Black-owned businesses fast enough, and threatening to raise a new legal action for not dancing fast enough. But remember, that is tied. So this is one of the reasons that what we're covering tonight is so important. This is how the diversity industry operates in every sector, in housing, in general, like in employment, in credit and financing, in media, in any sort of traditional corporate business, in the nonprofit area, right? It is this unholy alliance between the big regulators, the big businesses, and the big community organizers. And the people who end up getting screwed are those who are not involved, while the system itself is getting poisoned. And then ultimately the system itself, when it totally collapses, and as long as you get out with your gold, then you're fine, as a lot of the big folks did here in this story. But I wanted to draw a parallel there, because what Byron Allen did with Comcast and AT&T in media mega mergers is what every single one of these groups did at a local, state, and federal level to all of these big banks from the period between 1994 and 2007. And I will show you exactly how that happened in the next section. But on the next slide, I try to put myself in your shoes, and I say, this is effing crazy. Where are the regulators in all of this? So if you remember, if you remember, there was that in the NCRC, they talked about how the acquisition of the bank they shook down will be complete once approval is received from the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. And there I've got a little bit of background on that office. I can tell you more if you need to know more. But
I'd like to know, because since I saw the name Comptroller, I've been curious. What is a comptroller? Is it different from a controller?
Yeah, it's just controller of money. It's like I don't think this is the prefix origin, but it's like the controller of compensation. It's the comptroller is just the authoritarian. They sort of work hand in hand with Treasury, and you can think of them like a treasurer, sort of, except related to the Treasury's operations wing. But there, in what do you know? Remember, the bank approval is conditioned on the head of the Office of the Comptroller. The Office of the Comptroller that's the organization that's tasked with regulating, chartering, and supervising all national banks. Well, guess who the keynote speaker at the NCRC annual conference was?
I don't know.
It was the head of the Office of the Comptroller. So you're imagine if that hasn't, if the magnitude of that hasn't fully processed yet. Imagine you're a bank, okay? And, as you said, you would react if they came up to you. And this group says, hey, JF, nice bank you got there. By the way, if you want to be ashamed if something happened to it. We know that you don't want to stay in place on this treadmill forever, and that you're going to need to expand like every business does if it wants to grow. And we looked at your 5-year, we looked at your annual report of what projects you have upcoming and your 5-year projections and all that. We see that you want to expand the business. Well, we really feel bad for you, because, we know that you're going to need the head of the comptroller's blessing on all that. And it would be a real shame if he withheld that consent. Well, we might be able to be of service to you. I mean, he is our regular keynote speaker, and he's on record saying that we play one of the most critical roles in the banking system for providing equity to racial minority institutions and communities because of our critical role in ensuring fairness from banks. So since he's kind of hashtag our guy, and you need him in order to do business, how about you and I sit down at the negotiating table? Because we kind of got all the fucking leverage here.
My God.
And by the way, just think about that from a. So one of the parts of the stories here is how nonpartisan the government regulators are, and I'm going to cover all the ethics scandals that went down, and how pretty much everyone involved in this was involved in some form of the worst kind of white collar crime, whether that's taking kickbacks, whether that's bribery, whether that's money laundering, whether that's these ridiculously disguised payments, which were very creative often, but a lot of it came out. All of this is the regulators are in the pockets of these institutions, and it's just a question of who owns them. Does the diversity industry own the guy, or does the big business own the guy? And much of the conflict between the big businesses and the diversity industry comes down to positioning and lobbying and funneling money into the system to buy different people at different levels of government, so that you have the regulatory agencies staffed with people who will vote for approval if you're a big business, or who will vote for non-approval if you are a part of the diversity industry. I can document all of that, but
as far as I'm concerned, it's really stunning. It's the violent arm of the state against the liberty of businesses is essentially selling his image to the NCRC for political advancement goal, diversity pushing goals. Of course, I'm assuming that he's not. Is this guy the comptroller? I'm assuming he's not monetarily embedded in all this. He's probably staying clean and not getting involved in the NCRC or the banks. He must have some sort of independent image that he must project. But by just being there and the keynote speaker, he's giving his image, and he's making a statement to banks. My control is linked to your support of NCRC goals.
Right. Right. I mean, that is what is happening. Although I am going to document, the head of the comptroller there in 2016 is, that's the 2016 conference. I'm going to show you what happened in the years leading up to the financial crisis and who the players were there, so that you can see, sort of what happened, sort of directly for the crisis. But I wanted to sort of paint you a picture of what the dynamics here are. So,
and you asked the important question here: why? What motivates the regulators?
Right. So, and that's the last slide in this section, and there's 4 sections to this presentation. And it's you might understand what the big banks get out of paying off the diversity industry. Licenses to operate so that they can go on collecting their, billions in profit. I get what the diversity industry gets out of getting paid by the big banks. They get a shit ton of money in shakedowns, and basically a whole industry has popped up of secured long-term profits. But what do the regulators get out of the deal? And why the hell would they set this system up? So we are now ready for the beginning of the story, and
it's always a beginning with Frame Game.
Intended grandeur, yeah.
It's always a beginning with Frame Game. So is that what you call the kerosene?
That's the kerosene, because I want to sort of paint the picture of what people like to start the story in 2004, when subprime loans started getting really out of hand. and they're like, the damn thing just exploded spontaneously, and people just got greedy all of a sudden. I don't understand. Well, I mean, these fucking bankers, they must be psychopaths, that they were totally prudent with their money for basically several hundred years of world history, and then, oh my God, all of a sudden during this 3-year span they got crazy for no one reason. No, there has been gallons of kerosene building up under the surface, and we're going to go over what lit the match. But section 2 is the kerosene, the beginning of the story. So I start off with this quote from The Devil's Advocate. As an attorney,
I love this movie.
One of my favorite movies. There's a great quote that I like a lot, and it's where the protagonist. You should do a review of this for your cultural.
Yeah, that's true.
Thing. It's great.
But it's frustrating movie because it's not a perfect movie. It's a little cheap. It's a little overdone.
Mm-hmm.
But it's good.
That is true in parts. Yeah. Okay, Aaron in the chat is saying, name a particular group. You guys know me. I'm not going to have too much. No one is spared the extensive audit. We'll get there as delicately as we can. But all right, so there's that iconic quote from the movie where the protagonist Kevin Lomax asks his dad, the devil, which he just found out he's the devil. It's Al Pacino, and he says, "Why the law? Cut the shit, Dad. Why the lawyers? Why the law?" And his dad, the devil, says, "Because the law, my boy, puts us into everything. It is the ultimate backstage pass. It's the new priesthood, baby. Do you know there are more students in law school than lawyers walking the earth?" And then he says, "Dad, you made me do it. The devil, you made me do it." And he says, "No, I don't work that way, Kevin." So I thought this exchange is very insightful because the law was the club that was used to beat people into turning this large wheel, and this idea that the devil made them do it is, it is very sort of tempting to think of this as kind of like human nature. But the fact is, I believe in the great man theory of history, and some men are corruptible more than others. Maybe everyone has a price, but hopefully we are living in the age of heroes. But the era before us, they didn't rise to the occasion, and this is I guess the story of their fall. So in the next slide, we go to the birth of the business. So this is covering the set of laws and how they came about. So there in the birth of the business, we covered extensively the 1964 Civil Rights Act, if you remember. That was the act that ended once and forever the freedom of association and voluntary communities based on common national origin. That's how you would benignly frame American practices pre-1964. Or the sort of malevolent way to frame it would be the end of racially discriminatory Jim Crow segregation and exclusionary practices. So it really depends on how you view it. But 1964 is what got the ball a-rolling. So then in 1968, the Federal Housing Act was passed. And I want to set the stage here so that people can get the view of history they're not allowed to tell you in public school. You heard the civil rights movement was a peaceful, warm, social justice oriented, nonviolent, totally monk-like movement that and it was through the strength of the moral imperative they created through the righteousness of their cause that these laws were passed. Does that sound vaguely like your thoughts about how the 1960s civil rights movement won?
If you ask me, how did the black people won the civil rights movement and other minorities? It's a woman who was forced to sit in the back of a bus, and she decided one day to sit in the front of the bus. She claimed their space into society. She refused to abide by the racial rules. Isn't that the story
Rosa
of the
Parks.
civil rights movement?
Yeah. I mean, that's great. That's a woman sticking up for herself so that she's not treated as a second-class citizen. Do you hear about, I don't know, tanks and rings of the National Guard being flown in to put a arm-in-arm ring around Congress as they vote in the basement to approve a constitutional change that will overhaul the U.S. Constitution for fear of being destroyed, along with the riots going on outside? Do they sound like?
Not at all. But did you say tank?
Mm-hmm.
Did they have a tank?
Oh, JF.
You gotta be kidding me, Frame Games. They had a tank?
So much to learn. Okay, let's go over this. 1964 ended Jim Crow, but the problem was it did it at the federal level, and there was still such a thing as reserve rights. I mean, technically they still are today, but it's been totally neutered. One of the bedrock checks and balances in the American judicial system, in our jurisprudence, is that we don't have a totalitarian federal government. And the federal government is supposed to be as small as possible, and states and localities are supposed to have reserve powers, and everything not federally regulated is to be determined by the local area where you are setting up your home. This way, you don't have a totalitarian federal state like Soviet communism or like, monarchic regimes in Europe. And you also have a large variety of choice about what kinds of regulatory climates you'd like to live in, because there's so many different states, so many different laws. If you don't like what the laws are in one state, you move to another one. But if it's a federal law, you don't have that choice. So the problem was 1964 provided very limited protections with respect to anti-discrimination in housing, in large part because housing was considered a reserve power that states could have control over, by and large, as long as they had compliance with the very minimal standards from 1964. Right. And so because of this, you were still able to basically engineer voluntary communities of common national origin, if that's what you so chose, and your state was sympathetic to it, and you sort of set up the right parameters. And so what happened was, I'm going to read you the things from the slide, but then I want to go through each of these images that I posted here, and reference links are below. What the 1968 Fair Housing Act did was it massively amplified and expanded the anti-discrimination powers in the housing industry. And it was passed while Washington, D.C. was being burned to the ground, and the National Guard had formed a ring around Congress to protect them from black rioters. I will show you the pictures of the Washington Monument ensconced in smoke as they were being totally strong-armed into this with some. If you think the Ferguson riots were nasty, or the BLM riots, they ain't got shit on the 60s. I'll run through the scope of them. But what 68 did is it reinterpreted the U.S. Constitution such that private housing transactions went from being governed by each locality or state's reserve powers to there being one centralized, uniform federal law. And this law is to be enforced by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. That name, by the end of this presentation, which I guess will probably be in two parts, will be burned into your memory along with the words corrosive, corrupt, like something darker than dirt. Like HUD is part of the regulatory belly of the beast here, and they're the ones who have enforcement power over the Fair Housing Act.
Okay,
but let's get into this a little bit deeper. All right. So we can skip to, I think, the second image. I'll skip to the third one here. I'll skip to the third one. All right. So here's the political context of the 1968 Act. And this is, I want to read you the Wikipedia version here, because when you hear what actually happened, it's like, oh my God, like this is the normie version of history. Okay, so this bill had been contested for many, many years. Like, people had brought it up, but they never had leverage to push it through, because basically, like, white communities, like ethnically homogenous white communities, were the last stand of, like, where you live, your dominion, your home, and your local community, was sort of the last leg standing, untouched, relatively untouched by, like, the superseding diversity laws about, who you hire, who you fire, who you promote, who you make loans to, all that stuff. So anyway, so the final breakthrough that pushed the bill past was on April 4th, 1968, when MLK was assassinated, and the civil unrest across the country following King's death. The next day, President Lyndon Johnson wrote a letter to the U.S. House of Representatives urging passage of the Fair Housing Act, and the Rules Committee, jolted by the repeated civil disturbances virtually at the door, finally ended its hearing and passed the House vote by a wide margin, even though it was basically pretty much dead in the water until the riots. But we're going to talk about the riots a little bit here, because obviously, what happened with respect to any political leader getting killed is a total tragedy, and there should always be justice through the legal system with that sort of thing. And to the extent that there's a systemic problem, it makes total sense on principles of justice to lobby and exert any sort of morally justifiable pressure you can put on people to change the law within reason. But what's a little strange is that possibly the most bedrock aspect of frontier American principles, that is freedom of choice around who you live with, was constitutionally outlawed because of the following series of events. Okay. So MLK was, so here in some of the links, it goes through it in some detail, but I'm going to read you the highlighted sections. So hearings have been dragging on. The consensus was a slight majority to vote the bill down. And then a few hours after MLK was assassinated, and the nation's mood changed dramatically as riots broke out in ghettos throughout the nation. Some 21 House Republicans immediately broke party ranks and urged passage of the Senate bill. On April 10th, with National Guard troops quartered in the basement of the Capitol to guard against violence from riots in adjacent black neighborhoods, the bill passed and President Johnson signed it the very next day. That's how fucking fast the bill became a law. And if you're wondering, well, were the riots really that scary? That were they really afraid for their physical safety? Well, let's go a little bit deeper. Okay, so here is a congressman recounting the events. Now remember, Washington D.C. was a white city until the 1940s, and then with integration and with the end of segregation, it became majority black, which was a huge change to the nation's capital. Recently, majority black in a country that still has not, is just starting to pass civil rights laws. And there were regular race riots all the time in the 1960s, as we'll cover here. And so this is the congressman recounting that Washington, D.C. looked like Vietnam the day of that vote. You could see the fires from the Capitol, and the whole place seemed to be in flames. The city was locked down. The Capitol was under guard, and nobody knew what was going to happen. The nation came close to pulling apart. And then Lyndon Johnson, by the way, if you don't know about Lyndon Johnson, he's the guy who architected the modern welfare state. He is the Great Society guy. I'm talking about him another time. But he, who had been pressing for this bill for a long time, urged Congress to pass to pass this bill as a tribute to Martin Luther King. Mondale said this was the single most filibustered bill in history. But once the riots broke out, the Republican lawmakers didn't dare. They didn't dare hold it up. So just for some perspective, The previous year, 1967, the Detroit riots destroyed 2,000 buildings. National Guard and Army combat troops backed by tanks were called in to quell the violence. There was a huge issue about which direction to go to stop this epidemic of Black racial rioting violence. Now remember, this was before the MLK assassination. So if you turn to the next page, I'm going to show you some pictures of the riots.
All right. Pictures of a tank. I finally got my tank that I was requesting.
You got your tank. And that third image from the the far right top one. If you click on that, it really does look like Vietnam. That's 14th Street in Washington, D.C. So if you can see, for example, how close these fires were, and they were rapidly spreading to the Capitol itself, where the National Guard had linked arms to defend them in the basement while they voted. You hear about the civil rights acts in the 1960s, and you think, oh man, it was their moral sense of duty and being convinced of the righteousness of the cause. You don't hear about the fist inside the velvet glove.
Wow.
So I think it's instructive for people to know that background. That is how the Constitution was changed forever.
We've not been progressing. We've been, instead of being progressive, we've been just trying to put a cover on a boiling pot of water, and we're just trying to keep the water in.
Right. Well, now a lot of what drove this was a conscientious policy decision beginning in 1967 after the Detroit riots. Again, it's before the DC riots that forced the Housing Act through. In 1967, there was a huge epidemic of Black racial riots, and nobody knew why they were happening. They had just won the 1964 landmark civil rights laws. They had full rights under the law in every respect, with respect to protections in employment, with respect to anti-discrimination. They were equal citizens in every respect that way. So why were they still burning everything down? And so a commission report, a very famous one that I'll talk about briefly in a second here, basically said, look, we got two choices here. Like, this is destroying our inner cities and all of our most prized architecture in the country. We can either, declare like ethnic racial war and shoot them when they, and I'm not endorsing this, by the way. I want to make this absolutely clear. I do not endorse violence.
But you are reporting the historical feeling.
I'm reporting the historical record. Either we escalate the violence, or we completely de-escalate the violence and address the symptoms of why they're rioting. Don't try to stop them. Don't stop them while they're rioting. Try to address the systemic roots of why they're rioting and win through honey rather than vinegar.
The SJW dream.
There was After that, there was a federal order put in place that police were not to use guns during Black riots. And this began the process of really institutionally forfeiting the idea that any disparities were not related to systemic racism, institutional bias, discrimination, and whatnot, because those were deemed to be the reasons that these groups were rioting, and it was a overarching policy goal to stop these riots. Because if you remember, the riots are not just the day of. It's not the property damage. That's nothing. The damage is the fact that everybody wants to move the fuck out of the neighborhood, and nobody wants to invest capital in the neighborhood because it's a risk to absolutely every aspect of your being. So this first one is just a recent article I have in my stash that I just thought was relevant to this talk, which is justifications for Black Lives Matter violence based on how successful they were using violence in the 1960s. But move on to the next one, and we're gonna go deeper down the rabbit hole here. So this this article is from a book written by a black gentleman who was 11 years old at the time of the 1968 DC riots, where the FHA was signed, who participated in the riots and wrote a book describing what happened that day. And he begins this by saying, with a Martin Luther King quote, where Martin Luther King says, "I don't like to predict violence, but if nothing is done between now and next summer to raise ghetto hope, that is, hope in the black urban communities, I feel that this summer will be not only as bad as 1967, but will be worse. That is, the rioting. Like, I don't like to predict violence, but I think there's going to be more black riots now this year, this summer, than last summer, unless you guys pass comprehensive legislative reform." That was Martin Luther King. So you can interpret that as like trying to be kind of, like nice and like a diplomatic liaison. That's a benign way to interpret it. Another way is to see it as a veiled threat, that as the leader of this community and as its sort of chief nationwide spokesman, this is what's going to happen unless you accede to his demands. So,
I mean, I think it doesn't even reach. I think it doesn't even reach my threshold for veiled threat, because a veiled threat would require some sort of not saying that there's going to be violence. For example, he could have been saying, "I'm sure there won't be any violence this summer. I am absolutely sure that no one will bother you." That would be a veiled threat, because the message is not encoded explicitly, but he's saying there will be more violence as a consequence of no ghetto hope, and it will be greater than last year.
Yeah, and you can mitigate that with one sentence by saying, "But let's do everything in our power to prevent that from happening, and I disavow as a leader," and no, the problem is physical violence and the threat of wide-scale civil disruption and economic disruption is leverage. It's power. There's two ways you get power in this world: leverage and value. Value is you can provide something good. Leverage is you can induce something bad. Either one will get you there. And this is the tack they took. So here was the guy who participated in the riots as a kid, and here's him recounting the events. Now remember, history tells you that this was all to do with Martin Luther King, and kind of paints the impression that like these weren't a regular thing, even though they very clearly were, and had happened from the late 1940s. On a regular basis, including the one in Detroit that was totally massive and destroyed Detroit once and for good in 1967. But here is what he says on record. So he's being interviewed and he's saying, wasn't it sad? It's really, this must have been a really sad spiritual moment. Martin Luther King just died, and now you're out there, trying to get your justice. And here's what he says. One of the things that people don't realize, or that they misremember, is that rioting is a lot of fun. It wasn't all political. It was kids having fun. Let's go down there and get something. Let's throw rocks through the windows and see what we can get. There you go, folks.
It does show that the revolutionary doesn't necessarily understand the reach of its political actions. I mean, the people who were throwing rocks, they were probably not understanding what impact they would have on the law in the long run.
Right. But it's more to color the sense of this being, that there is this strategic leverage point of characterizing racial riots as being benign in character, as being wholly justified by the moral righteousness of the cause. And obviously, Molotov cocktails and shooting firefighters who are trying to put out blazes for fun is not really in line with like the cause of like equality per se. So he goes on to talk about how that's exactly what they did. Molotov cocktails into buildings, bottles, bricks, rocks, at firearms who were trying to put out the fires that they were causing. It was part anger, but it was also part exhilaration. And basically they conspired at night. There was a 5:30 curfew that was put in. The riots lasted 4 days. But they met in barbershops and on stoops and did what they called the, quote, ghetto telegraph to coordinate where they would riot in the morning. And then they put a sign on windows that identified themselves as black, so that fellow black rioters wouldn't loot their businesses. So he says he put a sign in the window that said "Soul Brother." We weren't the only ones that did that. It was supposed to identify an African American business. Some of them were saved. Some of them were burned anyway. He interviews National Guard folks who talked about how they were bitter that they couldn't use any sort of weapons against the rioters, and how they were incredibly scared because they had to hide behind chicken wire on their fire trucks while trying to put out fires and getting weapons thrown at them. More than 1,000 people were injured. And they burned down all of the white businesses like Sears, Morton's, and Woolworths that employed thousands of black Washingtonians. So at the end of the riots, there was a massive displacement of employed African Americans in D.C., plus white flight from the city, because D.C. became overwhelmingly black in the aftermath of this, because people fled to Maryland and Virginia because of how dangerous D.C. had become and the fear of when it would happen next.
It's fascinating because you made a whole we made a whole episode. I believe it was the end of white civilization, or maybe it was another episode. Oh yeah, what's to come? And we discussed how Washington D.C. converted from majority white to black, and now you give us an insight into how a young black person felt in that crowd. It's absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, and also the role of demographic change, right? I mean, if they were 5% of the population, they would have the numbers to burn down a city and coerce Congress to permanently change the U.S. Constitution and affect the livelihoods of people in Montana and Idaho and South Carolina and but it was literally diversity by gunpoint, and never forget that. So let's move on now to the post 1968, and let me know on timing if you want me to. We can call it after this section, and if you want to do that on timing.
I think we should keep the video relatively short, so we can do a part 2 and cut it out after this section and after some super chats. Yeah.
Okay, great. So we're at the year 1974 now, and this is when it still wasn't enough, and an additional set of racial regulations related to financial institutions participating in the real estate industry was unveiled. This is the ECOA, the Equal Credit Opportunity Act. So remember, we just had we had fair housing, and now we've got equal credit. And the idea was it prohibited financial institutions like lenders and mortgage lenders, commercial banks, from discriminating between otherwise creditworthy borrowers on the basis of race or the other various protections as it was amended. Now, in 1974, the ECOA it required financial institutions to be race neutral. And I have pulled below from the statute book the exact phrasing here. So, and it's still in the books. The letter of the law is that the ECOA requires financial institutions to be race neutral in their application of lending, right? Like if you take race into account, it's illegal. Okay. Mm-hmm. So, and I have pulled up there, the statute which says that. But then I want to show you how the frame game works in the law, which is the explicit words of the law versus the way it has been interpreted and twisted, which is its diametric 100% opposite. So I have pulled up here the Fed's Consumer Compliance Handbook for EOC compliance. And what does it tell us? Well, disparate impact is all banks are liable for disparate impact, which means racially neutral policies are illegal under the law if they create a collective disproportionate impact. And they give the example of a lender's policy to deny loan applications to single-family residences for less than $60,000. So because that's going to disproportionately affect like black and white residences in lending, that could be illegal. So you have the letter of the law saying it's illegal to take race into account. And then you have you have the law outlawing being race neutral in the event there's any sort of statistical variance in your numbers.
The law is
So-
not about outcomes, but the guide is about outcomes. That's why these guides, I hate them, because they're written by technocrats, and it's not clear that you can do anything other than the text of the law, because the text of the law will be very specific. Any explanation you add will be more restrictive or less restrictive. And are you telling me that this guide that you show us, Fair Lending, does it attempt to describe this particular statute, the number 9?
I'm telling you that a law is passed with letters on the page, and that's called the statute. And then when there are disputes, the statute is interpreted by a judge who determines what those words mean. And in and I say this again as a Jew, but it's sort of a sensitive topic, which is something you related to the Talmud, which is the Talmud is a document very famous for this phenomenon, which is that what matters is not the letters on the page of the Torah. What matters is the sort of Talmudic interpretation of that, which is based on a absolutely gobsmacking volume of interpretations throughout the ages. And in the law, we call that common law doctrine. That is, the words on the letter of the law have to be interpreted. And one of the reasons that I call myself Frame Game Radio is because as an attorney and as somebody who's very focused on language and on messaging and on persuasion and things like that, I have spent a lifetime observing and taking advantage of this phenomenon, this quirk in the human brain, that the words don't matter at all. At all. All that matters is the interpretation. And you can, through strategic maneuvering, you can make the words on the page say their exact opposite, not just change a little bit, the diametric fucking opposite, just by changing the interpretation of the words and creating and expanding new definitions for them. So the way the statute has been race neutral has been interpreted is that race neutral is illegal in the classical sense. Race neutral means disparate, means collective racial numbers. Okay. So if you're an individualist, if you're a classical liberal, if you're a libertarian, if you're a centrist, if you're a Martin Luther King loving liberal who's not a total SJW, you should be on our side for all of this shit. We're on the same team. This is corrupt. And it was the principal driver of the fucking financial crisis, as I'm going to chronicle in the next part of this. But this is the frame game. You have a law that makes it illegal to be race neutral, and it makes it illegal to not be race neutral. Mm-hmm. So that was the state of the devil's profession of the law before the Community Reinvestment Act was passed in 1977. So it's going to get less complicated from here. This is the last of the sort of like big background shit. Okay. 1977 still wasn't enough because banks had this practice of not investing. They weren't discriminating with respect to individual loans. They were, but what they were doing is they were saying, okay, we're just not going to do business in certain areas that are bad credit risks for us. Okay, so we are going to draw out a map, and because the fact is, certain property in the city is gentrifying and rising in value, and certain parts of the city are deteriorating and falling in value. And we don't want to take on mortgages for places that are likely to fall in value, because that's going to make repayment of the loan less incentivized for the buyer, right? Because they have less value in the home, so it's easier for them to just walk away from it. They lose less. And it's and likely poor credit risk. So this had a racial disparate impact because disproportionately banks in drawing their maps would not lend to certain minority neighborhoods. And what's very interesting actually, and this is the middle image that I have pulled up here shows you the evolution of redlining. And what's really interesting is, they categorize cities often according to like 4 grades, where grade A were the best ones, and that's green lines, so the ones drawn in green. And part of the calculus for how grade A they were was how ethnically homogenous they were. And this is a solid, fairly uniform indicator that a tremendous number of banks used. They recognized, whether, I'm not sure if they had statistical data to back this up, but certainly, if not intuitively, then at least through decades of business practice, understood that that artificial diversity causes division, and that causes the whole suite of negative externalities that were published by Robert Putnam in his Pulling a Loan study. And what that does to the housing properties in the area is it tanks them. And so they recognized that some level of commonality with respect to national origin led to more stable and rising housing prices. So anyway, the Community Reinvestment Act that so much of what we're going to talk about in the next episode hinges on was passed in 1977, only requiring banks to reach out to low-income borrowers and communities, not to lend to them. They recognized it would be batshit fucking crazy to sell unprofitable loans to borrowers who have no job, no income, and no assets to put up as guarantees. And you can't make a down payment, nothing. They realized that that's fucking crazy. So they said, listen, you have a requirement to reach out to these communities, make a good faith effort in your marketing, in your advertising, in the general way that you do business. And that also did set the stage for a lot of the community organizer payoffs and the relationships between those entities, but not to lend to them. And the other thing is, in 1977 is its provisions were based on class, not race. What you see later is the CRA gets explicit. They have to be Black. They have to be Hispanic. They cannot be white. Now, not all aspects of the CRA are with respect to that, but the most pernicious ones are explicitly racial, and I'll document that on the next one. But it wasn't intended. It was supposed to be class. It was supposed to be based on you as an American, which is what I would, I would much rather be arguing over class than race. Class is not immutable. Mobility changes things. You have more power over your fate, and it's less divisive. But as you'll see, beginning with the Clinton administration, it became explicitly racial. Now, the other thing about the 1977 Act is that it started the habits of banks being issued a CRA report card by regulators and scoring them based on their outreach efforts, so that they had an affirmative rating that they would be accountable for. And if your rating was less than satisfactory, then it did empower regulators to block mergers, acquisitions, various regulatory approvals, other kinds of corporate contracts and whatnot. So we're almost at the end of this section.
Now the chat is requesting a white pill. Unfortunately, I think you had planned your white pill for the end, so it might be in part 2. But it seems that they are getting depressed.
I have some funny pills coming up.
Okay.
I have some funny pills coming up. But look, I mean, I see. Look, the fact is, where we are right now, I hope it's almost a little bit like Holocaust-y in a way, if you'll allow me to draw the analogy in a benign and respectful way. Knowing the tragedies of what you've overcome can help you develop a sense of pride and persistence in the fact that you're still here. And in fact, the fact is, CRA right now under Trump is so much more manageable than it was before the entire House of Cards collapsed and everyone went bankrupt. This was only a decade ago, and it's still fresh in the memory. And our guy is in office who has his head on straight about all this. And guess who's in charge of HUD now, determining whether the CRA goes through?
Who?
brain surgeon Ben Carson is in charge of.
Ouch.
Yeah, that's right. The
I
I
had
think
not
that's
thought
funny
about
because
him for a while, so I was happy. He hadn't bothered my mind, but now he's back. You've just re-imprinted his image in my mind.
Ben
But
Carson.
yeah, I do remember the interview where he was saying he was moving on to this HUD thing. I didn't know about
Yeah.
HUD. So you think it's a good thing? A good thing?
I think it's fantastic. I'm not saying it's the end goal of these things, but I mean, you know, the goal is to be in a better position tomorrow than you are today. That's today's goal, right? And like every day that you move forward on that is a victory. Now, obviously, you're not gonna plant your victory flag until until it's over. But the fact is, okay, fine. You guys want it now? You guys want it now? All right. So it's buried at the end. Maybe I'll just send you some articles so that you can understand just how absolutely terrifying this is to the diversity establishment, what Trump is doing to the community investment scams. So if you just run a Google search, for example, for CRA reform is an attack on communities of color. An article by Sharon Velasquez from February of this year.
All right.
So this article, Sharon Velasquez, who is on the board at the NCRC. Big shocker there, right?
And the blog is on greenlining.org.
Yes. And there she laments, Trump's reform efforts and how this is going to absolutely set back 60 years of progress in terms of the diversity in industries, ongoing, previously safe revenue streams. And Trump has promised major revisions to weaken the CRA and the banking shakedowns in that space. And it's pretty awesome stuff. We can get into it in some more detail later, but these guys are not winning right now. I mean, right now it depends on what exactly the reform looks like, and he says he wants to do it next year. But remember, read between the lines here. So take, for example, the paragraph that says, why a major revision to the CRA is bad news. So if you read the last sentence of this paragraph,
at a time
she says,
expect so-called regulatory reform to remove the incentive for powerful bank investments into low-income communities and communities of color.
Yeah. Do you remember what the incentive was?
The incentive.
The incentive was that they were threatening to economically bankrupt them, or use the regulators in their pocket to have control over their business dealings.
Oh yeah.
And so the incentive was to pay them off just so that they could go on with their business or have a license to operate.
Yeah.
The incentive wasn't profit because they're not fucking profitable. So Trump is fucking saving the world with this shit. I mean, it's amazing. Don't let anyone tell you it doesn't matter who you vote for. I mean, this is literally, can you imagine when I tell you the Clinton relations to all this, it's a lot of this will start to make sense of just how fucked we would have been if Hillary had won. But times are changing, man. Have hope. And not just that, we Supreme Court now.
That's true.
Like, there's a lot of shit here that is I'm trying to tell you the story of your people. Like, I'm trying to sing you the song here so that, not to blackpill, but so that you understand how the world works. Because if you don't know these things, you're not gonna be able to make accurate future predictions, B, understand why people are doing what they're doing. You're going to misdiagnose everything, or you're going to fail to take into account highly relevant dynamics that you otherwise wouldn't be exposed to because nobody else reports on this shit. And then, also because you guys, you need to know in order to be able to communicate to others. And I get the sense that that the folks on our side of the political cause and what we want to advance for a better world, um, are passionate, but just don't necessarily have the kind of talking points memo with respect to the diversity industry that you need. The fact is, like, coming up with a theory of white privilege and institutional racism didn't happen overnight. The ability to convince hundreds of millions of people to believe in some boogeyman conspiracy theory based on 12,000 different variables, each with very tentative grounds. No, it's because they had education and they built the academic foundation for the arguments, and then had an army of people who were able to articulate them.
Wow.
And that's how you win the frame game. So that's why that I see this as white pilling stuff, guys. You're armed now. Now you can convince your friends. Don't tell me there's not one person in your network who, if you told this story to in a well-paced, sympathetic, caring, and if you need to, like, social justice minded attitude, like that, you couldn't plant a seed or two with one or two people in your network. Don't tell me that, because I know IRL that this shit works. So not on the hard end of SJWs, but this stuff sticks with people. It doesn't change them overnight necessarily, but it gives them the space to start to see the patterns in their own life. And then once they do, the entire puzzle gels because of the pieces you provided earlier in time.
You are empowering us with summer barbecue memes that we can use while eating barbecue with our friends, and they are very powerful. I wasn't aware at all of the CRA thing and the involvement of Trump.
Yeah.
We were throwing money into a hole of non-profitability.
Well, my very last segment here in this section is on the role of Clinton. And I think that you guys are going to find this pretty fascinating for those who don't. Because if you remember, all this started in what year? 1992. Well, that's weird. I think the husband of Hillary Clinton was like elected president of the United States that year, and he did it with real estate developer money, like Mark Rich, and that's how weird, right? How weird. We're going to solve that mystery in a second here. So the next slide we can skip over. It's just there was the First Amendments happened in 1989, and that was public reporting. So let's go to 1992. So if you were part of sort of the American zeitgeist at the time, Bill Clinton was commonly called our first black president. And that's like a national meme about Trump's presidency. And he, went on Arsenio Hall in sunglasses and played jazz saxophone. He made a living based on sort of civil rights advocacy as governor, and appealing on racial grounds in the South, and when the South was changing. And if you remember just the charts at the bottom, but can you play this clip? Oh, it's the one before this one. It's the slide before this one, Jeff, the one with the YouTube.
This
video.
one? Unfortunately, in the Prezi, I don't know. Is it this one?
Yeah, it's the one with the YouTube link with Bill Clinton on it.
Is it Clinton brags about affirmative action housing skyrocketing under him?
It's the one after 1989, and it's that one.
Okay, I'm playing it.
Affirmative action? Well, we had some blunt talk on affirmative action. I don't think the whole debate ought to be about affirmative action. I mean, look at what we've done, for example, with something was supposed to have a civil rights impact that's largely economic, the Community Reinvestment Act, passed in 1977, over 20 years ago. Now, the Community Reinvestment Act was set up to say to the bank regulators, look, you guys go in and look at these banks and tell them, you got to take some of your money and invest it in inner cities, in neighborhoods, and with people who otherwise would not get it, so they have a chance to build homes, to build businesses, to create jobs, to build neighborhoods. In the 20-year history of the Community Reinvestment Act, 85% plus of the money loaned out under it to poor inner city neighborhoods have been loaned in the 5 years since I've been president.
So he is the one who did it. He brags about it.
Oh, and not just that. Clinton also set up the first of what we're calling empowerment zones, which were $100 million block grants to oh, sorry.
What? Are you there?
Yeah, I'm there. Can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah.
Oh, I still hear the clip in the background. But
Oh, you hear the clip? Well, I think it's on your side because I'm not playing it.
Okay. All right. Cool. I'll close out of this here. Okay. Yeah, it was on my side. All right. So it wasn't just the CRA. There were a whole swath of related things that Clinton did that were extremely dirty with respect to this element, including creating the empowerment zones. He created the market for the real estate reverends who shook down Starbucks. So remember, we talked about, like, why is it always these black church leaders who are operating these, $500 million real estate portfolios in Harlem and in Philadelphia?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's because they were getting money through the empowerment zone, among other sources that were usually federal or state grant money related to this. Clinton adopted a full court press to pump money on a racial basis into these inner city communities, and thereby kind of represent and bring economic justice to black voters, and further solidify minority support at a time where that was a very hotly contested issue. It was really the hallmark issue of the 90s and 2000s, and when we get to the Republican side of this, it's going to put the entire Trump phenomenon, I think, in a perfect perspective, because Trump literally upended the entire apple cart of what the GOP designed these laws to do. Because the GOP is just as guilty as Clinton on this, but for and really for the same reasons. Anyway, so Clinton did the empowerment zones. He did the CRA amendments. He did a few other things. I guess we don't really have time to get into now. But what I want to sort of leave things on is the end of the Clinton era, which, if you remember, the Clinton era was the era of the tech boom, of the dot-com bubble. And so even though these banks were starting to now venture into unprofitable markets, the entire market was going batshit crazy upward, all the way up until basically right when Clinton left office in 2000. So, and there's an extremely powerful clip on the CRA with teeth. You can skip this slide. The next one is an extremely powerful clip that I think is mandatory viewing.
The one on the
8
right?
minutes in length. Yes, the one on the right. It really is mandatory viewing. We can kick off with that next time if we're short on time right now.
If it's related to what we've seen up to now, I'm up for looking at it now.
Yes, this is okay. Sure, and if you want, maybe just play a couple minutes of it so you can get a taste of it.
All right, let's have a look.
Yeah.
But discrimination isn't always that obvious. It's sometimes more subtle, but in many ways more insidious. An institutionalized discrimination that's hidden behind a smiling face. Housing agents who say, well, there are no vacancies right now. That you just didn't qualify for the mortgage because your financial credit history wasn't good enough. Last year, the Federal Reserve Board found African Americans are denied credit for homes at twice the rate white Americans are. And it is pervasive. It's what we found in the banking case in Texas, SacuBank in Texas. Discrimination in lending, discrimination in rendering mortgages. The bank has agreed to change its practices, as you heard from the Assistant Secretary. The bank has also agreed to a $2.1 billion agreement where they'll make $2.1 billion available to families who are low and moderate income across the country for mortgages about 15,000 low and moderate income people will now be able to buy their own home because of the settlement we announced today. $2.1 billion is by far the largest settlement ever rendered to the federal government to settle a fair housing case. And in closing, the message of today is clear. You've heard it from a number of us now. This is a nation of laws, and this administration will enforce the laws. We'll take questions at this time. Yes, sir.
So this company will end up loaning this money and presumably...
Well, $2.1 billion that would not have been available to families of low and moderate income, low and moderate income families across the country. About 15,000 families we estimate will get mortgages who would not have gotten mortgages otherwise. But aggressively to take a greater risk on these mortgages, yes. To give families mortgages who they would not have given otherwise, yes.
So he knows that it's not gonna be he knows that he's compromising the money, that it's that the loans are risky.
Yeah. Now watch how he ends it.
All right, let's watch.
get the loans at all. They wouldn't have...
They would not have qualified but for this affirmative action on the part of the bank, yes.
Got that? We are forcing them to take risky loans because we are mandating affirmative action that the banks have to take. Now, mind you, this is 1998, okay? 1998 during the kerosene era, because what we're going to go over next time is that it was Bush who lit the fucking match on this thing.
Oh,
because
wow.
he wanted to shore up the Hispanic vote, and he launched the Minority Home Ownership Initiative that took this thing to the sky. Because you heard 2.1 billion, right? Cuomo's bragging in '98 about securing $2.1 billion from a bank. That's That's peanuts. That's peanuts. 4.5 trillion is what it came out to. That's nothing. So this thing hit an absolute match during the Bush era, and we'll cover all the reasons for it. There's a bunch more things here or a few more things here I want to get to, but if for some time we can stop it. Mostly I want to show the breakdown in hard data, how banks had to abandon all their soft data in their risk models because any reliance on soft data was deemed to be discretionary. And when you had human discretion and subjectivity plus a disparate impact, it is basically like prima facie evidence for like malintended, for racial discrimination, and can subject you to punitive damages and give these plaintiffs' lawsuits all sorts of financial leverage. So they all abandoned all of the soft data, and they only had to go on like a very broad outline, so I wanted to cover that in a little bit more detail. But it's instructive to note. The last thing we'll cover is the setup for right before the match hit. The year is 2000. Clinton is just leaving office. Remember, his last act is he pardons Mark Rich on his last day. So if you look at on the second to last slide here, it says, "But that's okay, we're rich." And the boom times of the historic internet bubble made the Clinton years money for virtually all participants in the financial sector. Banking compliance with the new CRA with teeth was just beginning, but few had to pay the price yet since the markets were going up and up and up. And just so you understand the magnitude of the crash after 2000, it was sudden and totally dramatic. And there in 2002, it looked like it would never bottom, right? Like if you didn't see that plateauing effect in 2002, it kind of looks like it would just never stop falling, right?
Yeah.
Well, a funny thing happened on the way to 2002. We are going to this will be the last. I really want to do one slide after this, but I will. I'll discipline myself, and I'll leave this as the last one, which is the final slide. The Clinton era ends, and so does internet money. But we'll be fine because there's bipartisan support from politicians and regulators from both the neocon GOP and the neoliberal DNC for the same plan, as articulated by the man that was then the most famous and respected economist in the entire world, Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist and New York Times, face of the New York Times in that era, where he called in 2002, in connection with George Bush's pledge to increase minority home ownership to 5.5 million families by any means possible. 5.5 million families. Like law of numbers here. That's insane. By any means possible, including the removal of down payments, the removal of basic and traditional credit standards, the works, in a deliberate, explicit attempt to win Hispanic brand loyalty to the GOP in an era where Pat Buchanan had just been defeated, and the GOP's strategic direction was to turn Hispanics into the natural conservatives of the new majority America. And he to fast forward a little bit through the story, he was successful at that. Bush actually got votes for the Republican Party all the way up to 44% for Hispanics by giving them houses. but there was something in it for everybody. There were the neocons who, remember, the neocon establishment that Trump defeated there was no wall. There was no immigration reform. It was only how much amnesty and how fast. It was illegal to bring up immigration in this era until that man walked along. And both the Republicans and the Democrats got in on this because the money was driven by the following economic principle, as articulated by the economic mastermind Paul Krugman. Alan Greenspan, the chief of the Federal Reserve, needs to create a housing bubble to replace the NASDAQ bubble. And what you will see, and that we'll go over, is that the period from 2002 to 2008 was an unholy alliance between the neocon Bush administration and the Democrat developer DNC power structure to create a twofer. You get the economic the recovery of a housing bubble of housing prices rising, and which helped the DNC, the sort of left wing real estate complex, and you had the buying of Hispanic votes via the siphoned brand loyalty from the GOP being the party of minority home ownership. And it was this 1-2 punch that drove an enormous raft of public-private partnerships and dealings that lit the match on fire.
So Trump saw all this and he opposes to this.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know exactly how much Trump saw in this. I mean, Hillary and Bill's footprint on this is much clearer than Trump's, but suffice it to say that Trump was a New York, Manhattan real estate mogul. I don't know, I can't get inside of his mind in terms of the extent of what he knows or of what he thinks in terms of, what particular reform needs to look like in the short term and long term. But he knows this is the dirtiest game in town, and it's the biggest game in town. This is the biggest industry in the world, and this is what the diversity industry did to it.
Absolutely spectacular report. Let's have a look at some of the reactions of the crowd. Sin526 says, ask Frame if he would be willing to lend his services to assist in the formation of implicitly pro-white non-profit organizations. JF, I've doubled the amount of cash, so please read this one. I read it. So implicitly pro-white non-profit organizations. What is there to think about this?
Yeah, I mean, listen, the reason I've said this, forever, like the reason that I, express, pro-white identity views is because the moral imperative that I believe in to have identity politics for everyone or for no one. So, my long-term sort of vision of the world is to, help do whatever I can to reduce identity politics. And if you're talking about something that is, I have a futurist post genetic background on vision of the world, and I'm and the way you phrased the question, if it was rephrased in a way that had some other aspects to it that we could talk about another time, then it could fall in line with my personal vision statement. I'd need to hear the specifics of the facts.
All right, Blunderbuss says PayPal expelled Red Ice TV, therefore screw PayPal. Yeah, it's a very sad news. Red Ice TV being banned from PayPal. I don't know anything that Red Ice TV does that is not respectable. I don't understand this decision and I contest it. Dan Mann says Hispanic is broad term for Latin Americans. There are white, mestizo, mulatto, and African. Argentina, Uruguay, pre-Castro Cuba, example of white Hispanics. Netcompany 3 says, for $10, can't wait for Ryan Dawson on 9/11. I've been a fan of his long before I discovered yourself. I love the interactions between you two. Both of you are wonderfully autistic. Yeah, and Ryan Dawson is coming tomorrow. At what time? 7 p.m. Eastern Time. We have 3 interviews tomorrow. At 10 a.m. we have Jean Robin. At 3 p.m. I'm going on Jib Goat's podcast, and at 7 p.m. there's Ryan Dawson. Eric Stryker will be coming in 1 week at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and Vox Day is coming on August 2nd. Very interesting lineup coming up. Robert sends $20. He says, hey JF, off topic, but I just watched a Ramsey Paul interview of a French nationalist female named Electre, censored France on Twitter. Averon seems eager to speak about the current state of France. Great show, guys. Yeah, we were talking about having her on. I think I sent her an email or a Twitter DM. We'll get there. Sean Taylor, $10. I've missed the show live, but here's a down payment on what I'm sure is another high-quality show. Robert says, FGR's hobby is to conduct a detailed deep dive into his own people's subversion, his hobby, and the chat is still trying to decipher his hobby, and the chat is still trying to decipher if Finns are white. We are fucked, guys. Robert says, thank you, Frame Games, and what you and JF are doing is greatly appreciated. And finally, Undisclosed says, your work is much appreciated, Frame Game and JF. Robert also adds, go buy a Red Ice t-shirt to support them. Absolutely. So Frame Games, thank you so much for doing this report. It was fascinating. Are we seeing you next Monday or another day of the week?
Yeah, let's do that. Yeah, let's get back to Monday. And thank you, JF, for hosting a wonderful show, and thank you to the chat. We'll talk next week.
Now I see that I have no white guilt as a guest who was scheduled probably by Priveda. So would you be good with 8 p.m.?
8 p.m. on Monday?
Yep.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, see you then, and it was very fascinating. I can't wait to see the outcome of it.
You're going to see the match and the explosion next week. So it's going to be worth the wait.
Bye-bye.
Take care, guys.